Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me in Berlin this week is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor. We are not in the same room, but in the same city. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we are going to be talking about the economics of backyard barbecues. It's the start of summer, and so, appropriately enough, we thought we'd talk about all the grilling that may be happening. But first, we have another data point for you all, and that is 5, as in 5 bullets, which is the number that were fired at Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico several weeks ago.
The Prime Minister of Slovakia fighting for his life after what officials there say was an assassination attempt.
Arrested the suspected gunman at the scene yesterday. A government minister says there was a, quote, clear political motivation for the shooting, but did not provide details. CBS News senior foreign...
It was an assassination attempt that seems to have been unsuccessful and that Fico survived. But it's just one of a string of assassination attempts against global leaders in the past year. At the very beginning of the year, the leader of the Democratic Party of Korea, Lee Jae-myung, was stabbed in the neck by an assailant. The Ecuadorian presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio was assassinated in August of last year. And there have been a variety of other attempts on world leaders. It seems like the scale of political violence is increasing. And so we thought we would dig into the general topic and the economics involved in general terms. And so, Adam, I suppose I wanted to start by asking whether assassinations as we typically imagine them, I mean, this is a type of political violence directed against political leaders by some sort of self-organized group or individual. Yeah, are assassination attempts of this kind representative of some advanced stage of economic development? And I'm thinking here about whether one needs a kind of functioning civil society in the first place, you know, to produce the classic political assassin, the kind of maybe group out of which assassins emerge. I mean, and then I guess to that same degree, would other forms of political violence be characteristic of other stages of economic development?
This was a really fascinating question and has led me down multiple different rabbit holes. I think we might have to sort of maybe we can get a grip on this by distinguishing different types of killings that we could call assassinations. So, I mean, basically, if we take assassination to be the killing of an individual, the killing of a prominent political individual, as opposed to just plain murder or political killing, then we can imagine that being done in the context of a kind of political insurgency, whether by a rogue actor, an individual, or by a political grouping. We could think of it as targeted killing in the context of war. And then we could think of it as sort of palace coup type assassination, famously Julius Caesar. And depending on which one of those different modes you think about, they all have different histories, I think. And if you think of assassination as political coup-style killing, so an inside job, it really is as old as there's been political organization and some sort of rules against just killing in general. And so, I mean, we literally I think that one of the first Egyptian pharaohs, Pharaoh Teti, who ruled in the 23rd century BCE, may have succumbed to an inside job. And that then rumbles through history all the way down to the present day. You know, it's quite commonplace in the course of military coups that the incumbent ends up dead. So that has a sort of history that's almost timeless, I think, as a mechanism for resolving political dispute. I'm not keen on that kind of argument, but it's pretty hard to really see any period of history where it didn't happen. Assassination in war, like targeted sniping of the other side's king or general or whatever, has a more checkered history in that for long periods it was normal in the sense that kings and generals were involved in general combat. So the last king probably to be shot off his horse in combat was Charles XII of Sweden fighting Peter the Great in Russia in 1718, what was then the Russian Empire in 1718. And then in the 18th, 19th, and for much of the 20th century, targeted killing of the political leaders of the other side really went out of fashion. I mean, it was considered, broadly speaking, against the rules of war of the 18th and 19th century. It wasn't something that you did. You could kill the other side's soldiers, but you didn't try and snipe Napoleon. That wasn't fair at all. Nelson, the commander of the British fleet at Trafalgar, was shot. And so in that kind of close quarter fighting, it was more normal. But then in the 20th century, those norms disintegrated so that Hitler was targeted both by the British and the American Secret Service. Senior Nazis, Heydrich was executed by a British hit squad with the Czech resistance. And then in the wars of the 20th century, for instance, the PLO leadership were systematically targeted by Mossad and were themselves, of course, engaged in terrorism against the Israeli state. And in the new age of drone warfare, it's become the standard mode of operation. So targeted killing by drone has become the principal way in which America wages its wars at long range against both formal and informal opponents. So Saddam Hussein, for instance, was hunted down without compunction, as though he was just any other kind of target. The political dimension is the one which I think most closely conforms to your modernist sort of vision, which would be that it does take modern politics to get you there. And I think probably the origin of this does lie in religion, though, and to that extent it goes back quite a long way indeed to the origin of the term assassin, which comes out of an obscure phase in the history of Islam, which goes well above my pay grade in terms of scholarship. But it's basically the Islami sect, which are, I believe, a breakaway from Shiism, who became notorious in the early Middle Ages for their self-defensive strategy of assassination. And apparently the word assassin derives from a corruption of hashish, because they were not just assassins, but notorious for or legendary for their drug consumption. And so we get assassin by way of a series of derivations: hashishin, hesisini, assassin, assassini. And so that points to a millennial history, even of that kind of politically motivated assassination. It isn't quite the modernist line that I thought, because yes, when one thinks of the bomb-throwing anarchist assassin, for instance, it does point one to a rather modern history, but I think taken in the large, we would have to say it's a fairly regular occurrence of human politics. It's one, after all, it's kind of a temptingly efficient way of dealing with your problem. Why not just go to the head of the snake and cut it off?
So, I mean, if this, political violence directed, at political leaders, if that form of assassination, is the product of ideological polarization in societies today, I'm curious whether a kind of focus on economic policy mitigates that threat.
I think it's really fluid. I think the boundary between war, politics, economics are fluid and defined historically. It's a matter of the historical and social conditions that decide how much violence is just part of the normal process of doing business and defending the principles of private property, for instance. I mean, in a courthouse in Florida right now, the Chiquita Banana Company is answering charges of conspiracy of paying Colombian paramilitary death squads to execute leftist labor militants, and the Chiquita executives don't even deny that they did it. They just insist that they were coerced themselves into doing so. So in a context like that, doing business involved assassination as a fairly routine activity of your class opponents, of your left-wing political opponents. And there's a sort of meta-politics here, which is fascinating. And we see this particularly in the aftermath of great wars, and notably in the interwar period, the Weimar Republic, which we've talked about on the show, where you see the politics of peacemaking is a politics, amongst other things, about your choice of weapons, if you like, or your choice of the means of power. And in Germany, notably in the aftermath of World War I, the folks that advocated for what was called a policy of fulfillment, in other words, sign the terrible Versailles Peace Treaty through gritted teeth, and then get on with demonstrating by economic means that it was non-workable, and use Germany's too big to fail status to leverage change in the peace treaty, they were targeted for assassination by German right-wing paramilitaries and death squads that believed that Germany's only hope was, in fact, military confrontation right from the very beginning. So both Rathenau and Matthias Erzberger one the wartime organizer of the German war economy, and then foreign minister, the other the finance minister of the post-war period, were both assassinated. Rathenau famously said that he thought that Germany's destiny was the economy, and his enemies set out to prove that he was wrong.
That's fascinating, yeah. To try to assume the perspective of would-be assassins for a moment, I mean, it does seem like assassins are motivated by a desire to change the course of history. It seems like that's what is fueling their intervention in that way. And I'm just curious on basic terms whether they are correct. I mean, do assassinations successfully change the course of events?
I think there's a really interesting study that you found, actually, by Jones and Olken, that was published in 2009, where they look at a systematic data set of the evidence on both attempted and failed assassination attempts since 1875, of which they found 298 cases, 59 of which actually resulted in the killing of a leader. And what they asked was, what impact did this have on regime type? So then they used one of these, like the Polity database, which is a database which spans several centuries and ranks countries in terms of autocracy and democracy. If listeners have seen those statistical graphs which show the relative share of the world's population that live under autocracies as opposed to democracy, it's that kind of database. And then they've used a correlative war type database on armed conflict. And so what they've asked is, in these cases where you've got 298 assassinations, 59 of which are successful, what impact does it have on regime type in the aftermath? And what impact does it have on the incidence of organized violence? And unsurprisingly, perhaps they find that successful assassinations tend to lead to at least a temporary upsurge in low-level violence. So people go for guns, and this changes the name of the political game. But what they also find is that successful assassinations of authoritarian leaders tend, broadly speaking, on average, to lead to a slightly higher probability of transition to democratic conditions. So it would seem that this large-scale study empirically demonstrates the logic of revolutionary left-wing action, namely kill an authoritarian leader, and you have to weather the storm of a higher level of violence that follows. But statistically speaking, your likelihood of emerging with a democratic system is somewhat higher. It depends how you take the Polity measure and whether that's really a left-wing policy or simply a progressive policy, I don't know. But it certainly suggests that assassinations do make a difference. Unsurprisingly, they make the biggest difference in regimes which tend, as a structural problem, to have the succession question open. In other words, what do you do after the dictator is a key problem for dictatorships. Democracies just sort of shrug and move on and elect somebody else. Kennedy's killed, you put Johnson in, right? It's not the end of the world. It just vindicates the mechanism. Whereas if you kill a dictator, it's not obvious what happens next, because so often those regimes are really ultimately centered on that individual. So they're more fragile and they're more open to change as a result. So I think it, broadly speaking, kind of convincingly confirms one's intuitions.
That assassinations are efficient.
Well, I mean, if you're trying to get rid of a dictatorship, killing the dictator is not, generally speaking, a bad place to start.
No, it makes sense, but
it would seem. I mean, just on the basis of this evidence, blame the Polity database. It's not legal advice. No, don't do this at home, children. This is not one that we baked earlier.
Okay, so to extend to the broader topic, related but adjacent topic of murder for hire, I'm curious. Generally, what is the going rate on the black market for an assassination attempt, and how does that price even get established in the first place?
It's interesting. There's a couple of academic studies that you dug up, Cam, which focused on Australia and Britain, which came to the sobering conclusion that killing people is surprisingly cheap. Cheap in the sense that the value of human lives, if measured by life insurance and so on, runs into the millions. And the average or median cost amongst attested cases that came to trial of assassins was in the sort of $10,000 to $20,000 range to have somebody killed. Now, those are in a sense the less successful cases, because those are the ones that came to trial. And as the authors of the studies point out, highly successful, highly professional assassins presumably get caught less, so they may cost more, and this data may be biased. But a key thing about both those markets is that they're not large enough, and in the vast majority of cases captured by the law are crimes of passion, essentially, people wanting to have their intimate partners killed. That seems to be the main motive in those. But their data is only really a few hundred cases over several decades. So these are extremely, as microeconomists would say, imperfect markets for murder. They suffer from what apparently microeconomists call the double virginity problem, which is that both the person contracting the killer and the killer may have rather little experience of actually transacting on this issue. And so price formation is very imperfect, right? This is the language of a microeconomist. So I thought to myself, this is silly. Let's go to somewhere where contract killing is routine and where prices can be quite clearly established. So let's go to a place with a very large-scale organized crime problem like Mexico, where tens of thousands of people are killed by assassination, and where, in fact, we can get quite a lot of price data, and it's fairly well established. And it points in the same direction, which is that in a place like that, where there are many people who engage in killing for small payments or indeed none at all if they're part of gangs, it's part of a loyalty proof, the price is ridiculously low. In an advanced economy setting, $10,000 to $20,000. In Mexico, it can go down as low as 50 to 100. It's a day's work, essentially, for a bunch of young men, young kids on motorbikes who will kill somebody. In Mexico as well, though, there is a high-end market for assassination where if you want to kill a police chief, in one attested case, the going rate was more like that in Australia or Britain, which was about $20,000. But the cartels pay peanuts, and even in more complicated cases, there's been instances where they've hired US soldiers, Marines, for $5,000 to $10,000. You can well imagine a professional soldier with particular skills, hard up in his luck, being offered a deal he couldn't refuse by a cartel, and that would put you in that kind of range. So it's in those cases, killing is very much part of a repertoire of crime, which could start with people smuggling or with kidnapping, and outright murder then just becomes part of a spectrum of activity. The threshold is not that large. The double virginity problem doesn't exist because both contracting to kill and agreeing to kill, bargaining to kill, are routine activities carried out almost on a daily basis. What these prices tend to reflect is that the parties to the bargain, both those contracting and those agreeing to kill, clearly, broadly speaking, assume they're not going to get caught, because otherwise you would think, given the life-destroying consequences of agreeing to this bargain, that it would be much higher. Or conversely, perhaps in a drug and gang-dominated environment, the opportunity cost, in other words, your expectation of your life, is so low that even these kind of minimal payments seem reasonable.
All right. We do need to take a break here for now. We will be back in a second to talk about backyard barbecues. Hi, and welcome back. Our next data point is $67.73. That is the cost of a backyard barbecue party on average in the United States. That was in the year 2023, according to the American Farm Bureau Federation, a survey they ran. They were basically calculating that based on 10 family members or friends being included. The point is, this weekend is Memorial Day in the United States. That's typically the start of summer, which is the start of the season that people get together and grill meat and various other things on grills. And we thought we'd dig into the economics of backyard barbecues. So Adam, I thought we could start with kind of history of backyard grilling in the way that we envision it. I'm curious whether that's a relatively recent development in the United States from the 20th century.
This took me down another rabbit hole. It was very much the day for rabbit holes. One thing we got to get sorted out is the difference between barbecuing and grilling, or rather their overlap and their difference. Because the grilling, or the cooking of meat over open fires, is something that has a history that goes back literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. It's one of the first things that humans probably did as soon as they learn to manage fire was to cook meat over it. And that goes all the way then down to the Romans, who literally had portable grills, metal grills, iron grills, very, very reminiscent of a gridiron in the current day. And the patron saint of grilling, St. Lawrence, is the patron saint because he met his martyrdom being grilled alive. Apparently, at one point in the process, he had the chutzpah to call out to his torturers, "Flip me over, I'm done," and do the other side. And the shocking thing that this reveals is that grilling is a process where you cook with high heat and you expel fat and you crisp. So that's what happened to St. Lawrence. Barbecuing, in the sense that much of America knows it, is a very different cooking process. It's slow and low, as the phrase goes. And it really is something that Europeans probably first encountered when Columbus's expedition banged into Hispaniola. And in the early accounts of the Spanish voyages, something else emerged, which is a reference to a barbacoa. And a barbacoa really caught the attention of the Spanish arrivals, Portuguese arrivals in the New World, because it wasn't a metal grill over a hot fire. It was something different, which was a wooden contraption raised high over an open fire. So it was a slow smoking process. And the Spaniards and the Portuguese remark on the fact that the indigenous populations that they bumped into would cook fish all day long, which was not how you would grill fish, right, in a standard mode. But it's from that the distinctively American tradition of barbecuing really emerges. Smoky, long cooking, where you try and keep the succulence of the meat. Its crispiness is not the aim, but succulence. And you do it through slow cooking with marinades. It's out of this then that, so George Washington, for instance, and American independence was celebrated by giant barbecues in this sense, very slow roasted meat at low temperature. And it's out of this then that the classic Southern barbecue culture emerges in the late 19th century. It's very much a post-emancipation thing because barbecuing was something that was done on plantations. It's a rich person's sport, barbecuing, right? Because you're taking meat and you're cooking it in a essentially rather wasteful way, as you're allowing the meat to cook very, very slowly. And in the case of grilling, you're allowing quite a lot of the fat to evaporate. And so commercial barbecuing emerged as something that black cooks developed as businesses in the South from the late 19th century onwards. And it's at this point that, if you like, the sort of big macro history of barbecuing and grilling converges with what we would recognize today. Because as American urbanization developed, so also developed a distinctive culture of outdoor sports, not of the type the British upper class were interested in, which would involve, Scottish country estates, but business people taking to the countryside, businessmen taking to the countryside. And amongst them were people like Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, who used to go camping together. And Henry Ford was very interested in finding efficient ways of reusing the wood that was mass-produced, the wood waste that was mass-produced by his car factories. He was very upset by the amount of waste that was going on. And it's Henry Ford that actually pioneers the creation of large-scale synthesized charcoal bricks for outdoor barbecuing. From the early 20th century onwards, he's selling his cars with portable barbecues and charcoal bricks. And then the classic Weber grill, which is a sort of synthesis of the different elements, because it has a metal grill, but you slow cook in a steamer/smoke container. It comes out of the Weber company, which was originally in the business of making buoys, like for marking shipping lanes. And one of their employees thought, what if we cut one of these open, attach some legs, stick a grill in it, and then a valve or two so as to manage the heat inside? And it's out of the combination of the synthetic charcoal briquettes and the Weber small smoker that you get the backyard barbecuing culture of suburban America from the 1950s, 40s and 50s onwards, as a sort of synthesis of the old plantation, New World, slow barbecuing tradition on the one hand, the grill, and the industrial accoutrements of the 20th century. And that's what then has taken off to a certain degree worldwide. Though grilling and barbecuing, slow cooking, fast cooking, meat, searing it, has really a global reach. That distinctive American form is really a 20th century synthesis.
Fascinating synthesis. Wow, I did not know that, but it does make sense. But yeah, I guess to focus a bit more on charcoal, the kind of one of the elements that make grilling culture what it is, I guess I want to know a bit more about how that gets produced and how large a business is charcoal these days globally.
Charcoal is a very important thing because before the advent of large-scale coal mining, that's rock coal. It was the way in which civilizations around the world achieved easily controllable, extremely high heat. And you couldn't do that by burning wood simply because the wood contains far too much moisture, as anyone knows who's attempted to burn logs which haven't been allowed to sit and dry for a good long time. If you try and burn green wood, what you end up with is a smoky mess and a very cold fire. Charcoal is the opposite. So what you take there is stacks of logs, and then you essentially bake them. You don't burn them. This is the crucial thing, right? You don't combust them. You simply dry them out over a period of time in a kiln. And as you raise the heat around wood over 200 degrees centigrade, it changes color. So this is the 400 to 500 degree Fahrenheit range. It slowly drains moisture, becomes lighter and darker. And in due course, what emerges is charcoal. And the crucial thing about charcoal is that it's efficient to move around. It's light, much lighter than the underlying wood. And it burns at a higher temperature. And a well-managed charcoal furnace can get you up over the 1,000 Celsius mark, which is crucial because it allows you to melt iron and therefore essentially engage in small-scale wood-fired metallurgy. And until the advent of large-scale coal mining, that was the way in which metals were smelted. So it's a crucial technology in the development of humanity. And it still plays a very large role in not just, leisure pursuits. In fact, leisure pursuits barely figure in the global charcoal picture. There's about 47 million tons of charcoal produced annually, which is a very big deal and a very bad news for climate change and deforestation, because that's basically lumber that has been dried out and turned into charcoal pellets. But it's a crucial fuel source for some of the poorest societies in the world, notably Haiti, where if you've seen aerial shots of Haiti on the island of Hispaniola, where barbecue was first discovered, if you compare the Dominican Republic, which is relatively rich and uses modern fuels, with Haiti, which is poor, desperately poor, the difference is that one is still forested and the other one is almost completely deforested. And Haiti's deforested to feed not the building of wooden ships or something, but the production of charcoal for efficient domestic heating. It's very important in the domestic setting because unlike wood, it doesn't produce as much smoke. So you can actually sit in a room with a charcoal fire without gagging from the smoke that it produces. The biggest producers in the world, unsurprisingly, are places with big forestry. So Brazil, Nigeria, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo are all big charcoal producers. And it remains, therefore, a kind of key biofuel for poor societies for whom, expensive imported oil, gas or coal is not really an option.
So to shift attention to the grills themselves, obviously there are a range of, home grills on the market, and they range from basically simple fire pits to very expensive high-end equipment. And I'm curious, on that higher end, what are the features that are available? Is there an element of conspicuous consumption at work, or are there sort of features here that kind of are functionally useful?
Oh, there definitely is. This was quite a trip, actually, looking at the websites for very high-end outdoor, what are called outdoor kitchens, essentially. Companies like Kalamazoo in the US, or a German firm which is evocatively named Flammkraft, so flame power. And you can easily spend between 10 and 20,000 euros on an outdoor kitchen if you so desire. Crucially, what they do from a cooking point of view is they give you highly responsive, very fast, very high or low temperature, very easily controlled temperature grilling or barbecue facilities in which you can mix fuels, right? Because the big breakthrough in modern barbecues in the later 20th century was to use propane. From the 70s and 80s, this becomes very normal in the United States. It's not at all common in Latin America. The big barbecuing cultures of Argentina, for instance, they wouldn't dream of using gas. But if you want the ease of everyday cooking outside, most people prefer to use gas. But to add back in the flavor and the sense of authentic fire, the cool thing to do is to mix them, blend fuels, and the high-end outdoor cooking ranges allow you to do that. But looking around, the kind of most amazing story I found about high-end barbecue didn't concern either the cookers or the meat, but the sauces. And the most extraordinary of these is vintage bottles of the barbecue sauce that was prepared for the so-called McDonald's burger. So, when Michael Jordan was the star of the NBA, McDonald's decided they would make a Michael Jordan themed sandwich. And this had Michael Jordan themed barbecue sauce, and bottles of this occasionally show up. And I kid you not, they go for thousands and thousands of dollars, like ancient Michael Jordan themed McDonald's barbecue sauce is the price of extremely fine wine.
God bless whoever is serving that. Summer barbecue. It sounds like fine wine, but it's Michael Jordan McDonald's barbecue sauce. Okay. I was curious about the meat itself that gets served at these barbecues. And in the aggregate, I'm wondering whether meat consumption increases in the summertime as a result of barbecues. Or alternatively, is the rate of consumption of meat generally constant over the year? Are producers accounting for barbecues? Is there increased production of hot dogs, say in time for the summer?
So this is such an interesting question, and also striking the way that you put it as a story about the seasonality of meat demand, right? Whereas in traditional society, the question, and even the one that I remember growing up in, was the seasonality of meat supply. So it wasn't that in the summer we preferred to eat something, but that in the spring, for instance, there was lamb. And if you look at European traditional cuisine, pork is normally slaughtered in the fall and then provides sausage that sees a family through the winter. Beef is better eaten in the winter because the young animals are fed on the fresh grass in the summer. And so seasonality was essentially an effect of supply rather than, particular patterns of demand. There is in the US data an ambiguous support for the idea that meat demand shifts over the course of the year, less for the balance between different types of meat, so much as the shifting desire for different cuts of meat over the course of the year. So in the winter, in the slow cooking season, if you like, Americans consume more stewing meats, especially stewing beef. Whereas in the summer, what they want is New York strip flank steaks, which are more suitable for grilling.
Yeah, I guess finally, I'm curious. Generally, it seems to me that grilling remains a kind of gendered activity. Even in the phrases that sometimes are used, the term manning the grill, I remember that from my childhood, it seems to maybe still be in use. And I'm curious whether why that's the case, if there's an explanation for that. And is that perceived as a kind of market opportunity? Would there be money to be made by winning over more women to grilling? And is that something that people are taking advantage of?
It's definitely a thing, isn't it? Actually, one of my sore points is that though I'm an extremely keen cook, I'm not a practiced barbecuer. So I feel a relative degree of kind of gendered failure in this respect. But yes, it really is. I think it's an effect of the sort of 50s, 60s. Suburban culture in which it was a way of engaging men in domestic activity. It really truly is true. If you look at the kind of iconic image of the backdoor barbecue, it's a role inversion with the women by the pool watching the men, swigging beer and screwing up on the barbecue. That's kind of the standard trope. And it is very particular to American culture in that moment. A, that men found a way to involve themselves in cooking, but B, the whole thing inverts what in most cultures is the standard of gendered assignment, which is not only that women cook, but that women have a particular responsibility for the domestic hearth, for the fire, right? In fact, even in Western culture, it's synonymous really with marriage, the hearth. And it's feminized. It's something that the wife is responsible for maintaining, keep the home fires burning, right? During a war, that's an appeal to women to keep the home fires burning. And we're not talking about fires started by bombers. We're talking about the house, the home, keep it cozy, keep it ready for the man to return. And so, to have this sort of outdoor back to nature version where men all of a sudden are responsible for the fire, and it's not typical of non-Western cultures. So barbecuing is huge all over the world in different forms, and in many societies, even those that have charcoal barbecuing traditions, it's completely normal for women to be responsible for managing the barbecue. And if you look online, there is, in fact, you were asking about market opportunities, a niche of, say, Korean barbecue joints, which are primarily operated by women and which are marketed as successful cases of female entrepreneurship. Because for Chinese and Korean women, it's completely normal that they would be running the grilling process as well. So this assumption somehow that barbecuing is a particular type of cooking which requires manly skills is an unusual construction of, I think it's mainly, from my memory of Grillfester in Germany, which is not barbecuing, but cooking sausages or whatever over a campfire in the forest, was not that it was singularly gendered in the way that the American backyard suburban barbecue, as you say, definitely is.
It's interesting, yeah. Something to keep in mind for listeners who will be engaging in the process this summer. We do need to leave off here for now, but of course, we will be back as always next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.